Let's talk about grabbing sharp blades, both offensively and defensively. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So I've been made aware recently that there's a few misconceptions about the grabbing of sharp blades. Any regular viewers of this channel or any of the other channels that deal with weapon use like mine will be familiar with the fact that there are lots of blade grabs, not just in European martial arts, but also martial arts around the world. That are done both defensively and offensively. What do I mean by that? Well, an example would be, and I'll just take the glove off actually to illustrate this better, but an example would be whereby if someone's swung a sword at your head and you've stopped it with your own sword, there might be a grab or command or push on their blade in order to detain their blade for a second whilst you get your own counter-attack back on them. Okay, so there are grabs of blades, usually after they've been stopped and controlled with the blade of your own sword. So that'd be an example, and it's only one, but be one example of a defensive control of an opponent's blade. We find it with long swords, langmesser, dagger, rapier, small sword, all sorts, backsword, it goes on and on. So in European martial arts, it is not an uncommon thing to see grabs of blades. Usually, as I say, done after controlling the opponent's blade. Offensively, what do I mean by that? Well, quite simply, there are particularly half-swording done in European medieval sources. There are situations where you put your own hand on the blade in order to get greater control over this lever and to guide your point into openings. This is particularly applicable to armoured fighting, but this leads to the second misconception, which I'm going to deal with after this first one. The first misconception is that you can't safely grab sharp blades. Well, lots of people have demonstrated that you can. I have, Scalagram has, various people out there have demonstrated this. As a basic example, so here is a sharp wakizashi. Okay, not to say the longsword isn't sharp, but I think most people accept that these Chinese-made Japanese-style swords are usually pretty sharp. And just to demonstrate that this is indeed sharp, here's a wakizashi from Jaku. Incidentally, full review on its way, and I will demonstrate here that this is indeed a sharp blade. Okay, and I can absolutely grab that and hold it and wave it around. Is it comfortable? No. Has it cut me? No. Okay, however, there are better ways of grabbing it. Clearly, if I can apply pressure to the flats, that is better. With a single edge blade, if I can apply pressure to the back of the blade, that's better as well. Okay, and clearly I don't ever want to grab a blade that is in motion, either forwards or slashing, cutting, hacking, whatever. I want to stop and control it and then grab it. There is the elephant in the room of defensive wounds, and whenever we look at knife defense and we look at crime reports and modern self-defense applications, you will notice that defensive wounds are a big thing when we look at, unfortunately, at real world incidences where people get very wounded on their left hand and arm from trying to defend their body and their head. Evolution has taught you to do that. Yes, you will get grievously injured hands and grievously injured forearms, which is really, really grim, but it might save your life. Better to be hacked up and slashed in the hands and try and control a person's weapon if possible, and not get thrust through the body or chopped through the neck or something like that. So evolution has taught us it is better to sacrifice the limbs in order to protect the core, because it might slightly increase your chances of survival. It might not, but it might do. Okay, so quite simply, you can grab a blade. I'm not saying, however, that there aren't risks involved. Grabbing a blade, controlling a blade, always comes with risks. But clearly, if I put a glove on, then it reduces those risks. Okay, now this is the second part of the, I suppose, misconception or misunderstanding about blade grabbing. So grabbing blades with bare hands always comes with an inherent risk. Grabbing a blade with a glove on is inherently much, much safer. Now, obviously here I'm applying pressure to the flats, so I'm not actually in contact with the sharp of the blade. I can I don't have someone else here to do this for me, but they could pull that and there's no risk because my actual hand is not in contact with the edge. That's obviously made somewhat more complicated when we've got a double-edged blade, because you can't necessarily avoid touching one of the edges to some degree. However, when you do grab it, you can apply as much pressure as possible to the flats of the blade, and you will notice and experience that leather actually tends to stick to blades. Unless they're very, very oily, leather actually tends to stick quite well to steel blades, and so prevents them sliding. Now remember, the two main ways that a sharp sword is going to cut is either because it's in motion, which hopefully we're never going to be grabbing it when it's doing that, and that could be motion of a cutting motion or a pushing motion, or when it slides. So very importantly, when you do grab the blade, whether it's defensively or offensively, you don't want it to slide through the hand. Now, something I often have to tell my students in class when we're practicing half sword techniques is they put their left hand on the blade, and then I'm not going to do this because this will cut my hand wide open. They snooker cue or slide the blade in their left hand, and it's like, oh, if you just think about what that sharp blade's going to do to your hand, that's absolutely horrible. But even when you're in contact with the edges, if you've got a leather glove on, it massively increases your ability to grip it tightly and massively reduces the chances of that cutting you in any way, shape or form. The simple fact is, and I'm being somewhat careful with this because this is a very sharp longsword, I can wave this around in one hand, and this is a sharp sword and I've got a leather glove on, and it's not really causing me any discomfort or any damage to the glove. It's not an ideal way to use a sword. There is a good reason that we've got grips on swords and it's not just one big blade. Absolutely, you have to be aware of the inherent disadvantages of doing that and of handling the blade, but sometimes in certain situations it's worth doing. So, what's the second big misconception about blade grabbing? Well, it is that yes, you can do it in bare hands. Yes, it is safer in leather gloves. But the big misconception is that this is only an armoured fighting technique. It's absolutely not. It's something we find in all sorts of unarmoured martial arts and in the unarmoured parts of the medieval and Renaissance treatises that we study from. So whether it's Fiore or Talhofer or Paulus Cal or Polus Hector Mare or Joachim Meyer or Lecuckner or whatever, you can name all of the treatises. There are blade should we say touching the blade, grabbing the blade, controlling the blade with usually the left hand, sometimes the right hand, sometimes both hands in the case of a murder strike, with bare hands out of armour shown. So these are things which are sometimes done out of armour. Do I think there are things that are done hugely, massively, a huge amount of the time out of armour? Probably not. They tend to be finishing moves, they tend to be particular situations when you would do this out of armour. But if you're wearing leather gloves out of armour, and bear in mind that Fiore de Liberi specifically talks about this, he talks about fighting duels out of armour, okay? And when he says he's out of armour, he mentions that he's got leather gloves on. Now, having leather gloves on massively increases your safety and ability to grab and control blades. And it doesn't matter whether it's a European longsword or whether it's a Japanese katana or whether it is a rondel dagger or something like that, grabbing the blade. Okay, these are all things that are perfectly kind of fine to do in leather gloves, much easier to do than in bare skin, for example. But beware of the fact you still have to obey the general rules of don't let the blade slide through your hand and this kind of stuff. And I should also mention as well, I think a lot of people think you're going to have a tug of war with the opponent's blade, with your bare hand on their sharp blade. And the reality is that this is something that happens momentarily, a split second. It's a moment of control. So for example, it might be that they've swung at you, you've defended momentarily, and for a split second you command their blade for or push it just long enough in order to get your own attack in. And that's it, and then you're out. You're not grabbing their blade anymore. And then you're back out to normal fighting distance of cutting and thrusting. So these are, and you also have to bear in mind these don't always go against the blade. You can do the exact same technique sometimes against the hand, the crossguard, the hilt, the pommel, whatever. So these are more a principle of controlling the opponent's weapon for a split second as you offend them. So you basically control, much like you do with rapier and dagger, you control their weapon while you put your own attack in whatever way you want to. And then you'd come back to your not grabbing their weapon and not controlling their weapon necessarily. But absolutely these things are done out of armour and in armour. But there is again, a misconception that somehow these grabs are safer to do if you're in armour in terms of your hand. Well, this is a complete misunderstanding of how armour works. So what I've got here is a leather glove. Okay, now if we look at one of the most protective types of gauntlet available in this period, a Italian style steel, hardened steel in this case, mitten gauntlet. Okay, yes, this is hardened steel, super protective. However, if I'm grabbing someone's weapon, what's on the inside? It's a leather glove. Okay, so actually this, in terms of grabbing and controlling opposing weapons, that is no more protected than my little old HEMA sparring leather glove here, or fencing leather glove here. It's just a leather glove on the inside. That's not to say there weren't some specialised gauntlets for grabbing, and there were. In fact, there were special gauntlets which actually had very fine mail, aka chainmail, on the inside of the glove, specifically for grabbing the opponent's blade. Now, in some cases these were probably fitted to gauntlets. I'm actually not personally aware of any evidence at all for gauntlets being fitted with these, but I am aware of references to dueling gloves being used in the 17th century, possibly into the 16th century, where a fine mesh of mail was put on the inside of the glove, used with a rapier or a side sword, specifically for grabbing the opponent's blade and grabbing the opponent's weapon and controlling it. Now, if you had a fine mesh of mail on the inside of your hand, your fingers and your palm, that wouldn't only enable you to grab the blade for a split second like we would do with leather or bare hands, you could just really grab that blade and keep hold of it. Now, there's a disadvantage. So as I demonstrated here, leather has a tendency to stick onto a blade and prevent it from sliding in and out of the hand. If you had mail, it's steel, on the inside of your glove, whilst you'd be able to grip very tightly on the opponent's blade, it would probably have a larger chance of sliding. However, it doesn't matter because you've got mail on the inside of your hand. So even if that blade slides out of your hand slightly like this, it doesn't matter if you've got chainmail mail on the inside of your hand. However, it might affect the effectiveness of your grab and control on the opponent's weapon, but they'd really have to get quite, assuming you grabbed the blade about here, they'd really have to slide it through quite a long way in order to get their sword free again. Yes, absolutely, mail on the inside of the glove would mean that your hand was pretty much impervious to grabbing opponent's blades, but it's very important to mention that most gauntlets just have leather on the inside, they don't have mail. The other thing, parting thought I'd mention as well, is we usually see this in treatises applied to any sort of weapon. Okay, we see it applied to long swords, side swords, as I've mentioned, back swords, if we look at later period, rapiers, if we go back earlier, rondel daggers. If we're looking at pole weapons, there is really no issue at all. So the principal technique, if you're grabbing someone's pole weapon, essentially this is all handle. This is all something of the weapon that they might hold. So for you to grab it instead is really no disadvantage to you. Something like a spear this would apply to as well. So anything which has a long shaft is inherently easier to grab. Yes, it is more risky grabbing blades. Yes, there is always a chance if you don't do it right, you might get the hand hurt. And I think we should acknowledge this. I don't think that we should pretend that there aren't some inherent risks to grabbing your own blade or someone else's blade, defensively or offensively. We probably, as much as we can do, should, if we're interested in completely studying the martial arts, train how to do that safely. And that means that when we're teaching HEMA classes and we're teaching half swording or we're teaching blade grabs with longsword or arming sword or messer or whatever, you should be aware and you should be very explicit to the students when and how to do those grabbing techniques. Because honestly, if it's taught badly, it's wasted teaching time, because if it's done badly, it's never going to work as a technique. It's going to wound you, and it's not going to achieve the goal that the grab is intended to achieve, because you're not going to get control over the opponent's weapon. Okay, so you've got to make sure you teach the fundamentals of how to grab safely. And equally, half swording, if you're teaching armoured fighting, yes, half swording is absolutely an essential thing to learn how to do, but you have to learn how to do it applicably and safely, and it's not necessarily that easy a thing to do. And sometimes when we're training with blunt training weapons or feathers or even wooden swords or nylon synthetic weapons, I think we get an overinflated sense of the safety involved in doing it. Final thought: there is a difference, particularly in half swording or grabbing opponent's blades, depending on the nature of the blade. What do I mean by that? So, width, thickness, edge type or edge geometry. Quite simply, it is easier to grab a narrower blade. It is easier to grab a thicker blade. The two reasons for that being that broader blades mean your hand has to open wider to get around them. If you try to grab something like a falchion or a particularly broad langmesser, it's difficult to do unless you're able to grab just around the back. You wouldn't want to put your whole hand around the blade. Narrower blades are easier to get your whole hand around, and additionally they tend to be thicker, and therefore the edge geometry is not so fine. So for example, many types of rapier, I'm not saying all rapiers, but many types of rapier are easier to grab and control because they are a relatively narrow and thick blade with a relatively obtuse cutting angle on the edges. Not to say they can't be sharp, of course they can, but they are easier to grab and control than a broad blade would be. For that reason, we could argue that maybe grabbing of blades is something that we see more with the introduction of narrower blades. That's complete conjecture, but something interesting to think about, and maybe something we could look at in a future video. Anyway, I hope this has given you some food for thought, both in terms of how you grab blades safely, defensively and offensively when we're half swording, or indeed doing something like a moored schlag or something like that, which I'm personally not a big fan of, but certainly there in the sources, so we can't deny it. And additionally, the question of gauntlets. So the fact that you've got gauntlets on is really no different to wearing a leather glove in this specific topic, because inside the gauntlet might be steel on the outside, but inside the gauntlet it's just a leather glove. But that being said, leather gloves are a vastly preferable way of grabbing a blade than bare hands. So my basic advice would be, much like Fiore, if you at all expect to get into an unarmored duel in the street, gloves are one of your best friends. And if we were looking at a modern self-defense, self-protection point of view as well, if you think that you might be attacked by someone with a knife, gloves are great, okay? And these days we've got the advantages of cut resistant gloves. I won't say cut proof because they're not, and they're certainly not stab proof, but you do have Kevlar fabric and things like this. You can get gloves that will make your chances of facing an edged weapon vastly better. Your odds will go up a lot if you're able to grab things without getting your tendons and veins severed. So absolutely, gloves can literally be a lifesaver. I hope this has been interesting. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.